Hi, my name is Carrie and I'm 32 years old. A couple of years ago, I went through a divorce. It was a tough experience, but now I feel like I'm in a place where I can talk about it, so here I am. I've always felt like I lived an average life. I wasn't particularly great at anything. I did okay in school, and I was decent at most things I tried, but I never excelled at any of them. You could say I was a jack of all trades, master of none. My looks were pretty average too. I wasn't unattractive, but I wasn't the type to turn heads when I walked into a room. Growing up, I was comfortable with how I looked. I wasn't self-conscious because I'd had a few really handsome boyfriends in high school and college, so my appearance never really bothered me. That all changed when I got into a toxic relationship during my last year of college. At first, my boyfriend seemed nice. I knew he wasn't the one, but I enjoyed his company, so I kept seeing him. As my feelings for him grew, I started ignoring his bad behavior. I was so blinded by love that I didn't realize how much he was hurting my self-esteem. By the time the relationship ended, my confidence was completely shattered. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror without feeling ugly and breaking down in tears. It took me 5 years after college and leaving that boyfriend to start dating again. The person I began seeing was my now ex-husband, Nick. We met at a bar when I was out celebrating a friend's birthday. I wasn't drinking that night because I didn't like how overly confident I got when I was drunk, and I didn't want to embarrass myself. Nick was the one who approached me. "Hey, how's it going?" he asked. "Oh, hello, I'm good, thank you. How about you?" "I'm just enjoying the vibe here. Mind if I join you? Why are you sitting alone?" I needed a break from all the dancing. We're celebrating a friend's birthday. It looks like they're having a blast. They really are. They're all single, by the way, if you're interested. Why go to them when I'm already talking to the most beautiful girl in the world? You must need glasses if you're talking about me. My eyesight's fine. I could have talked to them, but I chose you. Oh. How about this? Give me your number, and tomorrow when we're sober, we'll grab coffee. I like that idea. We exchanged phone numbers and continued chatting until Nick had to leave for work the next day. I felt a warm rush of happiness. No one had ever approached me like that before. In all my past relationships, I was always the one who started the conversation. Nick slowly began to help me overcome my insecurities. The next day we went for coffee, just as Nick had promised. He made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. The first thing he said to me wasn't even a hi or a how are you. He looked at me in awe and said, "Wow, you're beautiful." I didn't think I could blush, but Nick made my cheeks turn red so often that it looked like I was wearing blush on purpose. We started meeting regularly after that, and soon we were dating. I felt so loved and appreciated. Whenever I was with Nick, everything seemed perfect. After dating for a year, we moved in together, and after 2 years, Nick proposed to me at the coffee shop where we had our first date. I was so happy that I said yes through tears. Our wedding was a small, intimate event with only our closest friends and family. For me, our relationship felt like a dream come true. Over those 2 years, Nick helped rebuild my confidence. He told me I was the prettiest girl in the world so many times that I started to believe it. He made me fall in love with myself again. That's why what happened later was so shocking and heartbreaking for me. During the first 2 years of our marriage, we focused on our careers. I worked at an accounting firm and earned a good salary. Nothing extraordinary, but enough to support myself. Nick, on the other hand, worked for a big company and earned 1.5 times what I did. He was always striving for more promotions, and I admired that about him. We both agreed to work hard because we wanted to start a family soon. We stuck to our plan, worked hard, and saved up a good amount of money. When we started trying for a baby, I got pregnant within 2 months. Nick and I were overjoyed. I felt like I was living my dream life. I had my dream job, lived in my dream house, was married to my dream man, and was about to have my dream baby. It felt like I had everything I ever wanted. Of course, I was nervous about becoming a parent for the first time. One night, after a tough day at work, Nick and I lay in bed and talked about our fears. "You know, babe, sometimes I get scared thinking about being a mom," I admitted. "It's just overwhelming to imagine being responsible for another life." "I feel the same way," Nick said. "The thought of accidentally hurting our child terrifies me. One small mistake could mess them up for life." Definitely, I agreed. But kids are resilient. They're not as delicate as we think, and being scared of messing up just shows that we'll be careful and make things right when we do make mistakes. You're right, Nick said. When I think back, my father was absent a lot. It left a void that nothing could fill. I don't want that for our child. You won't, I assured him. I'll be right there with you through everything. We'll learn and grow together, and I'll hold you accountable, just as I expect you to hold me. I promise to always be there with you, my love. How did I get so lucky with you? Nick asked. The feeling is mutual, babe, I replied. We're in this together no matter what. We'll be the best parents we can be. Even though I was terrified, knowing that Nick would be by my side comforted me greatly. I was certain that no matter what challenges came our way, he would be there for me. But I was so wrong. A couple of months after that conversation, I gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, and we named him Joe. The first few weeks with Joe were incredibly hard. He was a fussy baby who never slept at night. Nick and I took turns staying awake, and the lack of sleep started to wear us both down. We became cranky and irritable. To make matters worse, I was diagnosed with postpartum depression, PPD, so I struggled every day. I could barely get out of bed. Nick had to take care of most things: baby Joe, the household chores, and the cooking. I did what I could, but my mind felt like it was in a fog all the time. The only thing that seemed to help was lying in bed and crying. I tried to care for Joe when Nick was at work, but as soon as he got home, I would gladly hand Joe over to him. My PPD made it impossible for me to keep my job, so I had to resign and focus on coping with my illness. One day, after a tough day at work, Nick came home and lashed out at me. I couldn't get Joe to stop crying, and he said, "Why can't you do better as a mother? All you do is sit around." "What are you talking about?" I replied. "I'm fine with quitting my job, but I'm supposed to take care of Joe. If you can't even manage that, what's the point? You know I have postpartum depression," I cried. "How long will you use that as an excuse?" he snapped. "Do you think I'd lie about something this serious?" I asked. "Look at me. Do I seem like I'm enjoying any of this? Every day is a struggle, and it physically hurts not being able to care for Joe. I wish I could do more, but I can't." "I had a tough day at work too," Nick said, his tone softening. "My boss is pushing hard, and I'm on the edge, balancing it all, work and Joe. It's overwhelming." "I get it, babe," I said, trying to calm things down. "It's not easy. I'll try harder, do more, so you don't have to carry it all." No, I'll manage," Nick replied. "It's been 6 months since Joe's birth. I need to take my role seriously and support you. I don't want you to strain yourself. I'll handle things." "I want to do my part, babe," I said, "for Joe and for us. We're a team, right?" "Yeah, we are," Nick agreed. "We'll figure it out together." Even though I was terrified, knowing that Nick would be by my side comforted me greatly. I was certain that no matter what challenges came our way, he would be there for me, but I was so wrong. I started pushing myself to fight through the fog in my mind. I took care of everything around the house while looking after Joe. The only thing that comforted me was food, which is why I gained about 30 pounds. I didn't have the time or energy to work off all the food I was eating. I began to notice that Nick was spending less and less time at home. He still did his share of the responsibilities, but he was always working late. When he came home, he was too exhausted to talk to me or spend time with me. It hurt a lot because I was already struggling, and the one person who was supposed to be my support wasn't there for me. Every time I asked Nick why he was away so much, he said he was working towards a promotion for us. I just wanted one night with him, but he never seemed to want that. Even on weekends, he would lock himself in his office and work. Over time, I stopped asking and got used to his absence. One day, Nick surprised me by asking me to go with him to a work dinner. I was so excited that he was finally taking me out, so I went shopping and bought a nice dress. I got dressed up, dropped Joe off at my mom's place for the night, and expected a compliment from Nick, but Nick didn't say anything. I let it go, hoping the event would lift his spirits. At the dinner, I met a lot of Nick's colleagues, including his boss, Amelia. She wore a tight red gown that highlighted her figure and looked gorgeous. She approached us confidently with a pretty smile and greeted us with kisses on the cheek. "Hey, I'm Amelia." "Are you Nick's wife?" "Yes, I am. My name's Carrie." I thought so. I've heard so much about you. I hope most of it is good. Oh, definitely. You're quite the topic. Sorry for keeping Nick buried in work. I know he'd rather be with his pretty wife. Well, you better get him that promotion then. Oh, believe me, he's very close to getting one. That was good to hear, but the whole time, Nick just looked at the ground. He wouldn't talk to anyone when I was with him, but as soon as he left me to socialize on his own, he was open and laughing. It hurt. By the time the event ended, I was beyond upset, but I didn't bring it up because Nick didn't seem like he wanted to talk. When Joe turned a year old, he was a lot less fussy than when he was a newborn, so I had a little more free time. I decided to start looking for work, nothing too big, just something with flexible hours. After applying to a bunch of places, I finally got a job as a content writer. I was paid per article and could submit as many as I wanted, whenever I wanted. It was the perfect job. I excitedly told Nick about it that night at dinner, but he just grunted and gave me a half-hearted congrats. I didn't know why I expected him to be excited or happy for me. It hurt how little he cared, and I cried myself to sleep that night. After that, I kept myself busy with Joe, the chores, and my work. I began to feel better, and the fog started to lift, but there was still a huge hole in my heart that only Nick could fill. One morning, I missed him too much. After putting Joe to sleep, I walked into Nick's office. He wasn't home, but since he spent most of his time in that office, it had become his second room. I wanted to be close to him, so I sat in his office chair, closed my eyes, and took in his scent. When I opened my eyes, I looked at his desk and couldn't help my curiosity. I wanted to know what he did in his office all day. That's when I stumbled upon a manila file that looked out of place among the loose papers in the drawer. I picked it up and looked inside. To my absolute horror, I saw divorce papers. Nick had already signed them. The only space left blank was where I was supposed to sign. My heart shattered. I knew things weren't perfect between us, but I didn't think they were this bad. I still loved Nick, despite his absence. I thought he was just stressed about work and raising a child, but asking for a divorce was too much. I knew I had been difficult to deal with after giving birth to Joe, but I was really sick. There were many things I could have done differently, but at the same time, I felt like I couldn't have done anything. I sat in his office and cried for so long that when Nick came home, he looked surprised to see me sitting there. He saw the file on the table and realized that I had found out. "Nick, I need to know why," I said, my voice trembling. He looked down, avoiding my gaze, and quietly said, "Because I felt like the spark had faded." "Don't lie to me," I demanded. I thought if we were married, Nick would talk to me instead of just walking away. So I asked him, "Do you really want to tell me the truth?" He said, "Yes, for months I've been seeing someone, my boss, Amelia." I was shocked and asked, "How could you?" Nick explained that they spent many late nights at work together, and it just happened. Plus, she was very attractive. I asked, "Why would you do this to me?" Nick responded, "Look at yourself. I could overlook being poor, but you're not attractive anymore. You're so fat and ugly. Pregnancy ruined you. I regret getting you pregnant." I was heartbroken and asked, "How can you regret your own son?" Nick coldly replied, "I'd rather have a hot wife than a son. Sign the papers, I'm marrying Amelia." I was furious and told him he was heartless. I thought he loved us, loved me. But he said, "Things change, Carrie." In that moment, something came over me. I went to our room, packed his things, threw his bag at him, and told him to get out. I also said I would contest the divorce. Without a word, Nick left. I cried the whole night, wondering how he could do this to me and Joe. My sadness turned to anger. I wondered if Nick and Amelia had been having an affair when I went to that business dinner party. Is that what she meant when she said he would get a promotion? I wanted to break something but instead took deep breaths, pulled out my laptop, and looked up Amelia. I found out she was married too. I didn't have proof, but I messaged her husband on Facebook, telling him what I found out. I hoped something would happen and that Nick and Amelia would face consequences. The next morning, I forced myself not to look at my phone and focused on taking care of Joe and working. I needed to earn money to afford a lawyer. In the afternoon, I had a visitor. Amelia's husband, Jerry. He looked like he hadn't slept. He awkwardly asked if he could come in, and I let him. We sat in the living room, and he asked how I was holding up. I said I was okay, just trying to wrap my head around everything. Jerry said, "Yeah, I know what you mean. This whole situation is a mess. So why did you come over?" He explained that after my text, he and Amelia had a massive fight. He came over partly to get out of his place and partly to suggest that we get revenge on them together. "Revenge?" I asked. Jerry explained. "They both hurt us deeply. Maybe we can give them a taste of their own medicine." I agree, saying, "Nick not only betrayed me, but he also hurt our son. I'm with you on that. They need to understand the pain they caused." So we started planning. Jerry knew people in high positions at Amelia and Nick's company. He was the one who recommended Amelia for the job in the first place. Meanwhile, we tried to collect evidence of the affair. Jerry had access to all of Amelia's messages because her phone was synced with their iPad. He also helped me get a great lawyer. The next few weeks were hectic. We went to court for the divorce. Thanks to my lawyer, who presented a strong case of neglect, I had the judge's favor. During the trial, Jerry and I moved to the next phase of our plan. He contacted his friends at the company and informed them of Amelia's misconduct. Within a few days, both Nick and Amelia were fired. With proof of Nick's neglect and his unemployment, I won the case and got full custody of Joe. I also got more than half of our marital assets, making me financially stable. Nick and Amelia found out what Jerry and I had done, and they tried to contact us, leaving messages and emails, but we ignored them. Jerry and I started hanging out a lot after this ordeal, bonding over our heartbreak and betrayal. Eventually, we realized we have feelings for each other. Nick's constant neglect made me lose my love for him, and his actions sealed the deal. Jerry and I started dating a year after everything happened, and we still are to this day. He's great with Joe and has accepted him as his own son. A year and a half after Jerry and I started dating, Nick reached out to me. He had stopped trying to contact me 2 months after the court hearing since I never replied. He asked if we could meet at a cafe near my place. After discussing it with Jerry, I agreed. When I saw Nick, he looked haggard, like he hadn't been sleeping or eating. I have to admit, it felt satisfying to see him like that. He asked, "What's up?" "Make it quick. Jerry's waiting for me outside." "Jerry, why is he waiting for you?" he asked. "Oh, we're together," I replied. Nick got angry and said, "You got mad at me for sleeping with my boss, and here you are sleeping with her ex-husband." I calmly explained, "Jerry and I got together after what you and Amelia did. Our relationship was completely over when Jerry and I started dating. It's very different from what you did. Is this why you called me?" Nick looked embarrassed and said, "This is really embarrassing, but Amelia and I are pregnant and we're struggling a lot financially. It's putting a strain on our relationship. Do you think you could help me out a little?" I was shocked and replied, "Are you out of your mind? It's embarrassing that you're asking your ex-wife to lend you money to support your affair partner's baby. You're pathetic, Nick. Never contact me again." I couldn't believe his audacity. I walked out of that cafe with my head held high, feeling beyond satisfied. I had a loving boyfriend, an amazing son, and a good job that paid well, thanks to Jerry. I didn't know what happened to Nick and Amelia, and I didn't care. I was happy with my life and decided to put the past behind me. This whole experience prompted me to reinvent myself, and now I'm a completely different and better person. Thank you for listening to my story.
You need to heal your hand quickly, or it will get worse. I didn't understand why my husband George took me on a fishing trip in a rowboat and let me drift away while he filmed me laughing on his phone. I thought maybe he wanted to make up after an argument. But as I drifted alone, scared and cold, I realized his true intentions. Thankfully, a man rescued me, saving my life. My name is Carol, and I'm 38 years old. I live with my husband George, who is 3 years older. We used to work together at the same company, but in different departments. We didn't interact much until George started visiting my department for no reason. Eventually, he asked me out to dinner, surprising me. We grew closer and got married 2 years ago, much to the surprise of everyone, especially my parents. They were overjoyed at our wedding. After living with my parents, George and I decided to get our own place, not too far from my parents' house. I'm home. Welcome back. Dinner is ready. Is that curry I smell? Yes, it is. Let's dig in quickly. Awesome, your curry is the best. I usually take care of the housework because I finish work on time and don't have to do overtime. Even when I lived with my parents, I enjoyed cooking and cleaning, so it's no trouble for me. But on weekends or when George gets off work early, he takes over. Our life as newlyweds was going really well without any problems. But about a year and a half into our marriage, things started to go downhill. One day, while we were eating, George sighed and said, "You're lucky, Carol, not having to work overtime." George is a manager and has been really busy lately, working extra hours. Worried about him, I said, "Well, my job is more routine, but you have so much responsibility because you're trusted, George. That's impressive." But my words seemed to upset him. "What do you mean by that? Don't praise me if you don't understand. We've had arguments before, but this was the first time I saw George so tired. Not knowing what else to say, I just said sorry, and George stormed off to his room without finishing dinner. I knew George was tired, so I didn't argue back, but I was surprised by his reaction. I heard his department was starting a new project, so I hoped things would get better once he wasn't so busy. But instead, our relationship got worse over the next few days. A week later, I had to stay late at work unexpectedly. I need to prepare some urgent documents by tomorrow, which might keep me at the office until after George gets back. Feeling a bit uneasy, I decided to text George just in case. "I had to do overtime at work today. George, if you're not working late, could you handle dinner? Or should we eat separately tonight? Sorry for any inconvenience." It had been a while since I reached out to George like this. Remembering our last argument, I added sorry to the end of the message. But all I got was a red receipt with no reply. When I got home, George was eating what looked like a meal from a convenience store, and he didn't respond when I said, "I'm home," showing he was in a bad mood. "Sorry about dinner, work kept me longer than expected." Trying to ease the tension, George interrupted me. "Do you think it's okay to work late when I come home this tired? Are you still upset about what I said earlier? Trying to start a fight with good intentions?" I was surprised by how quickly things escalated. I asked again, "So you think I'm pretending to work late just to bother you, or I'm not finishing my work because I'm lazy?" His words stung. I really had to stay late at work. This has happened before, you know. What's gotten into you? I couldn't bear George's accusatory tone any longer. I snapped back. "I work hard every day too. I shouldn't have to defend myself against these accusations." But George ignored my words. "I'm already stressed from work." I couldn't bear to have this tension at home, especially when I was exhausted myself. My true feelings slipped out, albeit quietly, but George noticed and didn't let it slide. "Then just quit your job," he suggested, leaving me speechless. "It's ridiculous for you, Carol, who can't even manage housework properly, to be working. After all, I'm the one paying for this apartment. You don't really need the money, do you?" His logic seemed completely off base. Feeling my frustration rise, I unintentionally raised my voice. "How can you say that? I do take care of the house, and except for the days I work late, I handle everything at home. But lately on weekends, the cleaning hasn't been up to par compared to when we first got married. Seeing dust in the corners of the floor frustrates me. I didn't know what else to do." I felt like I was about to burst into tears. "You'd have more time to focus on housework if you quit your job, and it would be easier for you too. I'll even talk to management for you," I replied. "I don't think we should be discussing this right now." I decided to pause the conversation to give it some thought. I enjoy my job and don't want to quit, but perhaps if I supported George as a full-time homemaker, we could go back to being the happy couple we used to be. It wouldn't be wise to make such a big decision hastily. Unable to bear the tension at home, I went outside. Realizing I hadn't bought dinner, I decided to bike to the supermarket near the subway station. Riding my bike in the cold night air, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. What went wrong? Suddenly, I heard a loud horn honking from behind me and bright headlights approached quickly. Instinctively, I stopped. The next thing I knew, I was lying under bright lights and a white ceiling. Opening my eyes, I saw my parents' faces in front of me, exclaiming, "She's awake." Next to them sat George, his expression unreadable. I couldn't move my arm, and my fingers felt numb. Both of my arms were wrapped in circular casts. "This means you ran a red light on your bike," the doctor explained. I remembered now. I was on my way to the supermarket when the accident happened, but I couldn't recall if the light was red or green when I crossed. The driver was shocked too, but called an ambulance for me. The gravity of what I had done hit me, and I suddenly felt even worse. "But why are Mom and Dad here?" George was contacted first, and then he informed them. George gave a forced smile to my parents. Understandably, after what had happened, it was awkward for me too. I'm really glad George was there for you, my parents thanked George, who responded with a polite, no problem, but his forced smile didn't seem sincere. I ended up spending the night in the hospital due to the lateness of the hour. However, after undergoing various tests the next morning that showed no issues, I was discharged the following day. The doctor instructed me to rest and avoid water-related chores and housework because the casts couldn't be removed. When I got home, which happened to be on my day off, I found George lounging on the sofa with a smug look. You really messed up running that red light, but now you have no choice but to quit your job, he said without showing any concern. George lay there, staring at me mockingly. I felt powerless to respond, and to be honest, he was right. With casts on both hands, I couldn't even type properly on a computer. Faced with the decision of taking a long break or quitting altogether, I chose to resign, thinking it might improve my relationship with George. But leaving my job didn't magically fix things between us. Instead, it seemed to make him even more dissatisfied. He'd come home just to criticize me, using it as an outlet for his frustrations. During one of my worst days, George surprisingly suggested, "Why don't we go out together? It's been a while." I was suspicious of his sudden change in behavior, but George seemed to be in a good mood that day, and his overtime seemed to be decreasing. Maybe he was finally feeling less stressed. Perhaps today we could finally patch things up. Feeling more hopeful than I had in a long time, I joined George on an outing. We went to the beach, a place we used to visit together. Here, you can fish in a rowboat, George suggested, pointing to the safe fishing area where beginners could easily fish from rowboats. This spot held special memories for me. Although I had only been here a few times, it was meaningful because George had helped me overcome my fear of the sea by teaching me how to fish. I still remembered the fun times we had here. It's not scary, it's nostalgic, I said to George, who simply replied, yeah. Having a normal conversation without any snark or arguments felt incredibly refreshing and genuinely joyful after so long. After renting a boat, we successfully got on board. "Here, Carol," George said, offering his hand to help me aboard, just like old times. I carefully grasped his hand to get into the boat, being extra cautious since I couldn't use my hands to stabilize myself. Sitting down, I was reminded of our dates before we got married, which made me happy. Now we can finally get back to how we were, I thought, hoping this outing could mend our relationship. I looked at George, who then flashed a mischievous grin and kicked the boat off. "Huh!" I exclaimed, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of the kick. With a sudden jolt, the boat shot out to sea, quickly drifting away from the dock where George stood. Even though I wasn't rowing, George took out his phone and filmed me, laughing and taunting, "You better heal that hand fast, or it's going to be bad." In that moment, I realized I had been tricked. I blamed myself. I had thought that if George's workload decreased and I did the housework perfectly, we could reconcile. But I was wrong. This was George's true nature. Realizing this, I felt frustrated, ashamed, and sad, and tears started flowing. Sniffling and breathing in the sea breeze, I felt the fear of being alone at sea overwhelm me. I just wanted to go home. As I sat there, eyes closed, trying to push through the fear, a man's voice startled me. "Are you okay? You're about to drift out of the safe area, and are those casts on your arms?" There was a man, likely a father, and a boy who looked a lot like him, but when our eyes met, the man exclaimed, "Oh, aren't you Carol?" with a gentle voice. I remembered him. He was Matt, George's colleague who had come to our wedding. That meant the boy next to him must be his son, Mark, who had grown a lot since our wedding. I didn't notice. "What happened to you in that state? Weren't you in a bicycle accident?" Matt asked, clearly confused. "Yes, I was, and now I'm stuck here, unable to row, all because George put me on this boat," I explained. Matt seemed taken aback, understandably so. Being put on a boat by one's husband and left adrift at sea sounded like something out of a drama. "Let's call for help," Matt said, raising his voice and calling out to the boat rental staff. Thanks to him, I was saved, while Mark played on the beach. Through tears, I told Matt everything about George, how he had treated me, and how I ended up adrift at sea today. Gradually, Matt's face grew pained, and he cried with me. "It must have been hard," he said softly, offering a comforting word. I nodded, tears streaming down my face once again. Then Matt made a suggestion. I've been having my own thoughts about George recently. Would you let me handle it? After our conversation, Matt drove me home in his car. During the ride, Mark talked a lot, providing me with a genuinely enjoyable time for the first time in a while. I dreaded coming home, but it was unavoidable. With trepidation, I opened the front door to find George lounging carelessly in the living room. He smirked at me and said, "Wow, you're back. Always lucky with survival, huh?" Unable to find the energy to respond, I ignored him and went straight to my room to get ready for bed. The next morning, I didn't make breakfast for George and stayed in my room. With my hands in this condition, I couldn't cook properly anyway. But even before the boat incident, I had tried so hard to please George, even buying delicious bread. Now, all those efforts felt pointless to me. I didn't give George much thought throughout the day, and before I knew it, night had fallen. The sound of the front door opening signaled an unusually early return for George. He barged into my room and started yelling abruptly, "Hey. It was you, wasn't it?" Confused, I asked what he meant. George's voice grew louder as he accused me, "Don't play dumb with me. You're the one who told my company. What's going on?" I remained unfazed by his words, replying, "I don't know what you're talking about, but whatever trouble you're having at work doesn't involve me anymore. After all, I'm not even working there anymore." I waved off George's accusations, feeling no need to cater to him anymore. Frustrated, George stormed out of the house. The real shock came 3 days later when George, who hadn't returned home during that time, walked through the front door looking as pale as a ghost. "Carol, what should I do?" he muttered, looking lifeless as he shuffled into the room where I was relaxing. "What happened?" I asked. "I've been fired from my job," he said. "Oh, really?" I replied indifferently, watching as George collapsed to the floor. I had finally made it to manager. Despite his despair, I felt no sympathy for George because I knew this was coming. This was what Matt had hinted at when he said, "Leave it to me," during our conversation by the sea. According to Matt, George's behavior at work had taken a turn for the worse recently. He was mistreating his subordinates, dumping his work on others, falsely claiming overtime, and even harassing a new female employee, among other things. However, there was no solid proof of his actions, leaving them in a difficult situation. Despite being colleagues who were promoted to manager around the same time from different departments, Matt struggled to come to terms with George's behavior. But seeing how upset I was by George's actions, Matt felt compelled to take action. He suggested I check George's computer, suspecting it held evidence of his wrongdoing since George always took his laptop home. Matt couldn't investigate it himself. I knew George's laptop password. After safely returning from the sea, I pretended to go to sleep, waited for George to fall asleep, then checked and extracted the data from his laptop, which I then sent to Matt. I never expected things to unfold so quickly. Matt, the star of the advertising department, had acted swiftly and decisively. Standing up, I went to my drawer and retrieved something specific. Then, speaking slowly, I said, "I'm sorry to bring this up while you're feeling down, but I have something important to say." George looked at me with a puzzled expression, resembling a discarded puppy. After taking a deep breath, I continued, "I want a divorce." I finally voiced my decision, handing him the filled-out divorce papers. George's face shifted from confusion to a mix of anger and sadness as he looked at me. "Why do you want divorce? Can't you show a little compassion, especially when I'm feeling so low?" he pleaded. His words left me stunned, almost tempted to throw them right back at him. "I'm grateful to you for revealing your true nature, and I've already discussed this with my family," I stated firmly. This wasn't just bravado. After my ordeal at sea, I had indeed gone back home and talked with my parents. That night, Matt messaged me saying, "George might come crying to you in about 3 days. It's up to you, Carol, what to do next." Reflecting on my options, I decided to confide in my parents. I laid everything out for them, holding nothing back, including the terrifying experience of being adrift at sea in a boat I couldn't row. As I recounted the events, the guilt I had been suppressing and the emotions I had bottled up overwhelmed me, and I cried. My parents, who had held George in high regard, were deeply shocked by what I revealed. However, after hearing my story, they apologized for my pain and encouraged me to proceed with the divorce. Though I had been considering it, their support helped solidify my decision. When I shared my decision with George, he paled and eventually broke down, pleading, "Please don't leave me. I can't bear to lose you now." Despite this desperate plea, my resolve remained firm. "You should have realized before putting me on that boat," I told George. He deflated, sitting motionless on the floor. In the past, I might have comforted him, reassuring him that everything would be okay. But now I felt nothing. My love and feelings for George had long been discarded in the sea along with that fishing boat. "The divorce is final. I won't be your convenience anymore," I declared firmly, my pent-up frustration fueling my words. With that, I left George behind, motionless on the floor. I grabbed a backpack with just a few belongings I had packed the night before and left the house. The night air was cool and I felt refreshingly clear-headed as I made my way back to my parents' home. Despite George's continued pleas to stay together, I proceeded with the divorce through a lawyer recommended by my father. In just a few days, George lost everything, sinking into depression and eventually returning to his parents' house, where even his mother seemed to have lost patience with him. His mother was entirely on my side, repeatedly apologizing for her son's foolishness. I didn't have much affection for George, but I had a soft spot for his mother, which made the situation unfortunate. I've heard he's now unemployed, staying at his parents' home. It's sad to see how he could be so harsh to others yet unable to handle adversity himself. After successfully ending our relationship and receiving support throughout the process, I expressed my gratitude to Matt. Once my arms healed, I returned to work and realized how much I actually enjoyed it. I used to spend each day accommodating George, but now I cherish doing what I love, immersing myself in my work and feeling fulfilled every day. I'm eager to start anew, valuing myself and navigating life with care. I really thought Mom had a lot of money saved up. I mentioned it before, right? It's time to kick her out. Why keep a jobless person here? I've been living here for 3 months, and my son and his wife used up all my savings. They treated me badly. I had enough, so I left quietly. Then, my son called me. "Mom, what's happening?" Tony sounded worried on the phone. Around that time, something I did became big news across the United States. I'm Sarah, and I'm 70 years old. I lived in France for a while, but I got sick, so I came back to the States. My old apartment was gone, so I asked my son and his wife if I could stay with them for a bit. Tony, my only son, is 44 and works in an office. He and his wife, Alice, don't have kids, and they live quietly. We lost touch while I was away, but I decided to reconnect, and Tony seemed happy to hear from me. I explained my situation and asked if I could stay for a while. Tony agreed, though he seemed unsure. It felt awkward to rely on them, but the happiness of being with family again outweighed my doubts. With a mix of nerves and happiness, I took a taxi from the airport to their house. When I got there, Tony and Alice greeted me at the door. Tony seemed glad to see me, but Alice looked upset. "I plan to stay here for a few months. My stuff will arrive later," I said, leaving my carry-on bag and heading to the living room. We talked about our lives, jobs, and my time in France. When Tony asked why I moved there, I just said, "I wanted to enjoy the French countryside as I get older." Tony laughed, but Alice stayed unhappy. We also talked about my health issues. I've been dizzy a lot, and might have Meniere's disease. Sometimes I can't stand and feel sick when it happens. I don't feel safe living alone, so I want to stay with them until I feel better. After our chat, I went to get my stuff for my carry-on. As I organized it in the hallway, I heard Tony and Alice talking. "Are you serious about letting Sarah stay?" "I don't want to live with an old woman. She's my mom," Alice said. "You're not always home because you work part-time," Tony replied. "But what about when we're off work? How long is she staying?" "I want her gone." Alice insisted. "Mom will leave eventually. Let's talk about money tomorrow. Just keep it down, she might hear you," Tony warned. "She can't hear us, she's old." "Old age brings sharp ears for insults," Alice said. There I was hearing their conversation in the hallway. I felt bad for suddenly staying with Tony and his wife. It must be hard for them, but I'm happy to spend time with them after so long. When Tony was young, I raised him alone after my husband died. We didn't have much, and Tony faced difficulties with his health. This doesn't make up for that, but I came here to apologize and show gratitude. It's a shame I'm not welcome, but they have their own lives. I went to the guest room they gave me, trying to calm my anxious heart. The next morning, Tony went to work, leaving just Alice and me at home. While I was doing some crafting in the living room, Alice came up to me. Hey Sarah, can you clean up this mess? I looked around and saw fabric scraps and threads scattered about. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll clean it up. Do you want to see what I'm making? I showed her the small pouch I was sewing with a little green turtle design. It's a turtle pouch. I love turtles, so I make crafts with turtle themes. It even has a zipper on its shell, I explained. That's nice, Sarah, but you can't stay here all day. Find somewhere else to go when I'm not working. You're in the way, Alice said, cutting me off, clearly uninterested. But I get dizzy if I go outside too much, I protested. I'll drive you to the nearby community center to stay during the day. I have things to do at home, Alice said firmly, without room for discussion. She added, and while you're here, help with the chores. You're not just here to relax. Since we're letting you stay, do some cleaning and laundry instead of crafting. Stunned, I finally replied, okay, and slowly got up from the armchair. Despite feeling dizzy and sore, I ended up doing all the housework. Alice and Tony treated me like a housekeeper, and it seemed like Alice hadn't been keeping up with chores before I arrived. That night, when Tony got home, he asked, Mom, did you bring your banking card? He spoke with a smile. I don't mind you living with us, but life costs money. Could you chip in? I looked at Tony, nodded, and stood up. I took out my banking card from my handmade pouch and handed it to him. He checked it quickly, and his face tightened. Wait, Mom, is this all you have saved? Any other accounts? I replied, that's all I have. I don't need much at my age. No chronic illnesses or anything. I smiled as the conversation continued, but Tony's expression darkened. This isn't enough money, not even $10,000. You said you were living well abroad, so I assumed. Tony kept pressing me, asking if I had more money. When I said no, he sighed and slumped his shoulders. Okay, I'll hold on to this cash for now. I'm doing you a favor by letting you live here, so this is the least you could do. After getting my account password, Tony took my bank and debit cards and left the room. That night, lying in bed, I could hear Tony muttering through the wall that separated our rooms. This is disappointing. I thought Mom was wealthy. Our household is actually struggling financially. We shouldn't have let her stay. We gain nothing from having her here. They sounded confident, talking openly in the next room. Maybe they wanted me to hear them. In my cold bed, I fought back tears of loneliness and sadness. The next day, since Alice had a day off, she drove me to the local community center. When I opened my bag to continue my crafting, I realized I forgot the fabric I needed at home. I hesitated to ask Alice to go back and get it. Luckily, my dizziness wasn't too bad that day, so I decided to walk home to fetch it since I knew the area well. As I approached the house, I glanced through the window and saw Alice with a man I didn't recognize. They seemed very close, and I hesitated outside for a moment before deciding not to interrupt them. It dawned on me that maybe they wanted me out so I wouldn't interfere with whatever was going on between them. Back at the community center, thoughts of Alice and the man kept swirling in my mind, so I decided to call someone for advice. From then on, I avoided bringing up the situation and continued interacting with Tony and his wife as usual. However, whenever I left the house, I made sure to leave a red turtle pouch conspicuously on the living room side table. 3 months had gone by since I moved in with Tony's family. By then, I had essentially become the household's maid. When I was home, I had to do endless chores, and when Alice was around, I was sent off to the community center. Most of my savings had been drained by Tony, who had a gambling addiction. He spent most of his free time on lotteries and slots, likely stemming from financial hardships he faced as a child. At first, I tried to talk to him about it, but it always ended in anger. After enduring 3 months of hardship, I reached my breaking point. One night before a long weekend, I decided to address something I've been pondering. Tony, Alice, I want to thank you for letting me stay with you. Tony, I know I caused difficulties for you when you were young due to our financial situation. I apologize for any trouble I caused, but I'm grateful. I presented a homemade turtle pouch from the table. It was green with a zipper on the shell. This is a token of my appreciation to both of you. I hope you'll accept it. To my surprise, neither Tony nor Alice showed any interest in my handmade gift. Mom, enough of that. Can't we access some funds from your French account or something? Tony suggested. I already told you, there's no more money. Look, I put a lot of effort into making this. Can't you accept it as a gesture of love? Remember how happy you used to be when I filled the shell with candy and a bit of pocket money? Tony's irritation grew. I'm not a child anymore. I don't find joy in receiving something like this, Sarah. How much longer do you plan to depend on us? Frankly, it's irritating. Tony and his wife exchanged a cold look, appearing desperate. I asked Tony, do you remember Joe? He helped us out in that old apartment we lived in. What? I don't remember. Stop bringing up old stories, Tony replied sharply. A heavy silence settled between us as I held onto the turtle pouch tightly, feeling the paper inside. The next day, Tony and his wife went on vacation, leaving me behind. After our conversation the previous night, I had already planned to leave the house. I quickly packed my bags with the arranged carrier and sent them off to my home in France. I made sure to include the red turtle pouch in my carry-on bag. Leaving a brief note of gratitude and farewell on the table, I walked out of the house where I had stayed for 3 months. After leaving the house, I didn't immediately return home. Instead, I stayed in a hotel in the US for a while. I had matters to attend to, and I figured Tony and his wife would reach out to me eventually. True to my expectations, about 2 weeks later, Tony called. Mom, what's the deal with the turtle pouch? It's yours, right? Tony's voice sounded frantic over the phone. Oh, you noticed? I replied calmly. I wasn't surprised when I saw the news on TV about the turtle-shaped pouch. Inside it was a check for $1 million. It was my way of expressing gratitude for all they'd done and apologizing for any trouble I caused them when Tony was young. Some might think it shallow to make amends with money, but I had dreamed of this day for over 40 years, saving up bit by bit. Before meeting Tony after so long, I did some research and discovered he was in debt. He had tried to clear his gambling debts by gambling more, only to sink deeper. Despite having a steady job, he couldn't break free from the cycle. I simply wanted him to pay off his debts and find peace. However, they refused my gesture, forgetting the kindness they had once shown my family. So I decided to split the $1 million check into smaller amounts and donate it to charities and welfare organizations across America. I placed the donations in the handmade turtle pouch and sent them anonymously. The turtle pouch became a sensation, making headlines and trending on social media. Alice, isn't that the turtle pouch? Someone commented online. Yeah, looks like it, another remarked. Yes, that's the one. I was planning to give them filled with money too, I replied. I see. Well, he could have just told us. We would have accepted it. If you didn't want my feelings, then you don't need my money either. Tony's voice was angry over the phone. It's my money. How dare you deceive me? Give it back, he demanded. I couldn't bear to listen to Tony's anger any longer, so I pulled the phone away from my ear. After a moment, I spoke. All right, calm down. You're giving me a headache. There's one more turtle. And if you really want it, it's yours. Tony eventually settled down and insisted on having the turtle. We agreed to meet later at a cafe. On the appointed day, I brought the last red turtle in an envelope to our meeting spot. Tony and his wife were already there, demanding the money before I even sat down. When I silently pulled out the red turtle, Tony snatched it immediately, unzipping its shell. But instead of finding a check, he found a small electronic device. What the heck is this? Tony was confused. He found a tiny button and pressed it. A voice started playing, and Alice, standing next to Tony, turned pale. Seated next to Tony, Alice's expression changed as she heard a voice recording. It was her own, speaking warmly with another man who wasn't Tony. What is this? Why? What's happening? Alice seemed to finally understand that it was a recording of her having an affair at home. She tried to grab the recorder from Tony's hand, but he held on tight. While they struggled, I opened the envelope. I brought out several pictures and laid them on the table, showing Alice cheating with another man at home. Faced with undeniable evidence, Alice was flustered and kept asking, why? Why? Tony picked up the photos one by one, studying them closely. Something didn't feel right since I arrived at your house. A friend suggested I hire someone to find out, and even offered to cover the costs. Why would you do this? What's wrong with you? Alice's voice trembled. Well, you're my son's wife. It's heartbreaking to think family would deceive each other. Maybe you'll understand when you're older. Fate brought me here to uncover your infidelity, Alice. Have you been lying to me this whole time? Tony's disappointment was evident in his voice. Tony, when did this start? You have secrets too. If you're saying she cheated, You need to admit your mistakes, Alice argued. I never cheated. But what about the money you owe? Tony went quiet, and Alice took her turn to speak. What about you spending all your money on gambling? I only use the money I earn, and you have a part-time job, so you should have some savings, Alice replied. As I listened to their argument, it was obvious this couple had been holding on somehow until now. Both of you are broke. Tony, you owe $40,000. Alice, you've been giving all your earnings to your other person. I had someone check your finances too, I'd interrupted. Both Tony and Alice were really surprised, and they started yelling at each other. I was stunned when I found out about the investigation results. This couple was really close to running out of money. Listen, if we get Mom's money, we can pay off the debt. So just give it to us already, Tony insisted. I already gave away all the money. The only thing left is this red turtle statue, I clarified. He spent all my savings on gambling, remember? Tony accused Alice. What? No way. All of it? Alice's eyes widened in shock. In a fit of anger, Tony lunged at me across the table. Other people in the cafe started paying attention, and the staff rushed over. The $1 million was supposed to be mine. It's mine. Give it back, Tony shouted. Soon, the police had to be called to calm Tony down. After they talked to him, they kindly escorted me back to my hotel because I was worried about Tony's aggressive behavior. A week later, Tony and Alice's relationship had fallen apart completely because of the affair and money problems. They got divorced. Tony, now single, got even more caught up in gambling and debt. He was caught trying to steal money from his job and was fired. To make things worse, his angry outburst in the cafe was recorded and shared on social media, making it hard for him to find another job. Unable to face the embarrassment, Tony cut off all contact and disappeared. After the divorce, Alice didn't have anyone to depend on, so she moved into an old public housing unit and lived alone. Just as I was about to make a donation to help rescue turtles, a post I made online joking about my own turtle went viral. Alice started experiencing harassment and stalking because of it, which eventually spread to her part-time job and got her fired. Even the man she was having an affair with got tired of her and left. Now she doesn't have any income and is relying on temporary assistance for needy families. After that, I went back to my home in France. Once I finished unpacking in my apartment, I changed into a dress smoothly. While I was going over some work documents, I heard a noise at the door. It seemed Joe, my roommate, had come back home. Hey, Madam President. Welcome back. How was your trip to America? Joe greeted me with a smile as he hung up his coat and put down his bags. Hey Joe, I'm back, and look, I brought back so many souvenirs, I said excitedly. Wow, all my favorites. Thanks. I'll bring some to the storytelling event at the community center tomorrow, Joe said happily. Joe carefully examined each souvenir on the table, his face glowing with delight. After we both got back on our feet, Joe and his wife moved away for work. Years later, we unexpectedly met in the city, and I started helping with a support program for people in need that Joe had started. By then, Joe's wife had passed away, and we began working together as partners in both business and life. I've been leading the organization since Joe retired a few years ago. What began as a small initiative by Joe and his late wife has grown into a large international organization over the past 30 years. Currently, our focus is on helping single moms raise their children. A few years ago, we moved to France to study their advanced support systems. While we've become well-known in France, we're still not widely recognized in America. I plan to expand our activities there soon and wanted to spend some time with Tony and his family just as a mother before they found out about my work. In the end, I couldn't get them to understand how I felt, but that's their decision. Even though it was brief, I was happy to spend time together as a family. Now at 70 years old, I believe age is just a number. There's still so much I want and need to accomplish. I straightened my back in my dress and began pondering my upcoming international speech for tomorrow. See, it's clear now. All the money goes to your brother, as stated in the will. No need to doubt it, said the person in charge of the will. What? Are we really allowed to take all this money? My husband asked, looking at me and my happy sister-in-law. The will says that my brother gets the whole $100 million inheritance from our father. I feel really sad reading it. Does this mean I've lost everything and have to stay with this terrible man forever? But then, my brother says one thing that changes everything. My name is Catherine. I'm 55 years old, and I'm a housewife. My husband's name is Robert, and we've been together without any children. Robert is what you might call a typical male chauvinist. Ever since we got married, he's been in charge, and I haven't been able to speak up or share my opinions. Robert is 10 years older than me. He doesn't treat me with any respect. I feel like I'm his servant, always doing household chores. And if I do something he doesn't like, he's quick to criticize me. He even blames me for us not having children, which makes me cry almost every day. I've thought about divorcing him, but I don't want to worry my family, and I don't have the money to support myself. So I've been enduring his mistreatment and trying to stay strong despite his hurtful words. The only person who gave me any emotional support was my father. My father used to be a successful businessman. He built a company from nothing and turned it into a big company. Even though he worked a lot, he cared for my brother and me in his own way. But after my mother died in a car accident shortly after I got married, my father threw himself into work even more, maybe to distract himself from the loneliness. It was clear that my father's excessive work had taken a toll on him. He had a stroke and had to go to the hospital. Thankfully, his life wasn't in danger, but he was paralyzed on his left side. This was the cost of pushing himself too hard for so long. I managed to convince him to retire. I was worried about him being alone, so I convinced my husband, and we moved in with my father. Once he stopped working, my father seemed to age quickly. He started showing signs of dementia and soon became bedridden and needed constant care. Taking care of my father on top of everything else was overwhelming. I had to handle the housework, look after my husband, and now take care of my father, who had dementia. Sometimes he would be quiet, but other times he would yell and move around a lot, especially at night, or he would wander off. I was always tired from lack of sleep, stress, and the constant work. But sometimes my father would have moments of clarity, and we could talk peacefully like we used to. He would often thank me and sadly smile, saying, "I want to leave you with as much as I can." After 3 years of taking care of my father, he passed away. While I felt relief from the burden of caring for him, losing my father, who was my only emotional support, left me feeling incredibly lonely and sad. My only hope now was my father's inheritance. The inheritance amounted to $100 million, which would be split evenly between my brother and me, making it $50 million for each of us. With that much money, I could finally escape from my awful husband. It was my only chance for a better life. A few days later, my husband Robert and our eldest son's wife Naomi called me to discuss the inheritance. My brother, Naomi's husband, had been working overseas for a while. He came back for the funeral but had just left again yesterday, so Naomi was there in his place. "We found your dad's will in the back of a drawer. Luckily, it wasn't sealed. So let's take a look at it right away," Naomi said. "A will? I didn't know there was one. I was taking care of my father every day, but I never saw him writing a will. It bothered me that my husband, who didn't care much for my father, knew about it." I felt uneasy and had a bad feeling, Catherine thought. "Let's read it," Robert suggested. "All of my assets will be inherited by my eldest son Ken, dated April 1st, John Smith," Naomi read aloud. "That's it?" Catherine couldn't believe what she was hearing. She always thought her father's estate would be split equally between her and her brother. It was hard to believe that all of her father's $100 million estate would go only to her brother. "Well, hold on a second. That doesn't make sense. Why would it be like that?" Catherine questioned. My husband handed me the will and urged me to look at myself as I started to panic. Sure enough, it was written in the will, with my father's signature. I immediately suspected that the will might be fake. My father had always been fair to both my brother and me, and he wouldn't have favored just one of us. But could my kind and honest brother really keep all the inheritance for himself? As I pondered this, my brother's wife burst into laughter. "Wow, we get to keep all of his money. It feels a bit wrong, but if that's what he wanted, we have to respect it, right?" she said. I couldn't accept this at all. As I held the will silently, both my husband and my brother's wife glared at me. "Hey, are you doubting this? If so, you can bring in a handwriting expert or something. Just because it's inconvenient for you doesn't mean you can start doubting it. You really have a bad attitude," my husband scolded. "I'll do that," Catherine murmured quietly, deciding to have the will checked by an expert. To my surprise, The results showed that the will was undoubtedly written by my father himself. I was disappointed and fell into despair, thinking about the past. I had spent my life taking care of my husband and my father, enduring my husband's anger and hurtful words. It was painful, but the time I spent with my father was happy. I believe he cared for me too. The thought that my beloved father didn't care about me was more shocking and unbearable than not receiving the inheritance. I might have to leave this familiar house and land because they are part of my father's estate. My hope of divorcing my husband also seemed impossible now. When I told my husband about the appraisal result of the will at home over the weekend, he sneered at me with a self-righteous face. "That settles it. All the inheritance goes to your brother. Don't go meddling in things anymore. The will was real. Always doubting, you worthless wife," he said, leaving the house after saying those words. Lately, my husband has been spending a lot of time away from home. He comes home from work very late, and he's often not home on weekends like this. I found it suspicious, but I tried to avoid seeing my husband as much as possible. Surprisingly, I felt relieved. Despite my husband's objections, I wanted to talk to my brother directly about the inheritance. Even though he worked overseas and was always busy, he was a kind and dependable person. I made sure beforehand that he wasn't too busy, then I gave him a call. After exchanging some brief greetings, my brother once again apologized for leaving the care of our father entirely to me and thanked me for handling the funeral and various procedures. "Don't worry about it. By the way, Robert, about Dad's inheritance, was it always decided that you would be the sole heir?" I tried to ask casually. It was hard to bear the thought that maybe I wasn't loved by my father, but I wanted to discuss it properly. "Huh? What do you mean?" "All of the inheritance goes to me," my brother sounded surprised. I thought Naomi had told him, but it seems he was hearing about it for the first time. But the will was genuine, so the result wouldn't change. I explained the situation to my brother. "I see. So the handwriting on the will is definitely Dad's, and that's all it said, huh? Got it. I'll need some time to think this through. I'll get back to you. I'll also make sure Naomi doesn't do anything until I've made a decision," my brother said before ending the call. I waited patiently for my brother's next move, feeling both intrigued and hopeful. A few days later, my brother contacted me again. He suggested that I look into Naomi's suspicious activities by hiring a private investigator. He also advised me to claim my rightful share from him. This legitimate share is the minimum amount of inheritance guaranteed to a family member, based on their position in the family. In my case, I could claim a portion from my father's $25 million inheritance. Even though the will said all the inheritance should go to my brother, this legal provision would still entitle me to inherit $25 million. However, my husband and my brother's wife were not happy with my decision. "The decision has already been made. Don't mess it up now," they protested. But there was more to my brother's advice. "I'm not asking for the $25 million. All I want is this house filled with memories of our father and the land. The total estate is worth $100 million, but the real estate property is only worth $10 million. I'll give up all the rest of the inheritance to my brother." Still, the two of them continued to argue. If this continues to escalate, my brother has instructed me to hire a lawyer to join the discussion. If it comes to that, I'm sure I'll inherit $25 million exactly, I asserted confidently. My husband and Naomi fell silent. Eventually, it seemed like they realized it was more beneficial to settle for the $10 million worth of real estate. We finally reached an agreement on how to divide the inheritance. A few days later, I received the results of an investigation I had requested about Naomi from a private investigator. I immediately contacted my brother. After many ups and downs, we successfully completed the process of inheriting our father's estate. My brother Ken rushed from abroad to help during the process. I inherited the family home and land, valued at $10 million. My brother inherited the rest of the estate, which amounted to $90 million. Naomi and my husband seemed pleased with how things were going as they had hoped. After finishing the inheritance process, the four of us left the law office and went back to our father's house. While enjoying a cup of tea in the living room, my brother spoke up, placing his smartphone on the table. "Great job, everyone. Now that we successfully inherited Dad's estate, there's something I want to discuss," he said with a smile. With that, he took out a document from his pocket and laid it out on the table. The expressions on my husband's and Naomi's faces turned pale as they read the contents. The document was titled, "It's a Will." At the end of it, there was my father's signature and stamp, dating back about 5 years ago. "This is a will that Dad gave to me when he was still working. It was made with 2 witnesses at a notary office, so it's legally valid," my brother explained. He continued, saying that our father had prepared it before he had a stroke. With his wife already passed away, he wanted to ensure his children would be taken care of if anything happened to him. The will stated that 1/4 of the total estate was to go to Ken, who already had a significant amount of wealth, and 3/4 to Catherine, the housewife. My brother gently held the will, explaining that our father had been clear about not changing it. He had stated in the will that any changes must have a reason stated, otherwise they would be considered invalid. It seemed our father, knowing the size of his estate, had prepared early to avoid any family conflicts. He was really pushing himself at work. I think he was considering all sorts of things, like what would happen if he fell gravely ill or became senile. My brother said, his hand caressing the will. The will also contained a heartfelt addendum. "I hope that there will be no conflicts over the inheritance and that the family will continue to live happily together." It was filled with our father's warm wishes for the family. Learning that I was loved by my father just as much as my brother touched me deeply, and my heart swelled with emotion. However, my husband and Naomi beside me grew pale. "So, if you're going to change this will, the reason has to be stated, or it's all null and void. Even if it's in my dad's handwriting, maybe he was forced to write it when he was in a delirious state due to dementia." My husband suddenly slammed the table with a fierce expression. He glared at my brother and growled, "Hey Ken, do you have any proof? Are you calling me a criminal?" "I never said you forged the will, did I, Robert?" My brother replied calmly, then glanced at his wife Naomi sitting next to him. Naomi remained silent, which struck me as odd. Naomi had informed me about our father's passing, and I had attended the funeral. However, after returning abroad, I hadn't been informed about anything regarding the inheritance, despite it involving me. My brother seemed to be looking to his wife Naomi for some reason, but she still said nothing. "Stop your arguing. The inheritance is already decided. The $90 million is ours. It doesn't matter what you say now," my husband shouted back. "What do you mean by ours? I'm the one who inherited it," my brother countered calmly. "Shut up," my husband snapped. The conversation was going in circles. "I'm not sure what you mean, but the $90 million I inherited is just worthless paper," my brother said calmly. "What?" my husband exclaimed, surprised. My brother explained patiently. "Our father's estate was valued at $100 million. Apart from the real estate, all the assets were stocks in our father's company. When our father was in charge, the company was doing well, and the stocks were valuable. But after he stepped down, the company started losing money, and it looked like it might go bankrupt. In the 3 years before he died, the stocks that were once worth over $90 million became practically worthless." But that can't be true, can it?" my husband stammered. "It's the truth. I inherited knowing that. I plan on restructuring my father's company, and since it didn't involve you, I didn't tell you," my brother explained. My husband seemed shaken and muttered to himself. He couldn't seem to accept the reality of the situation. That's when Naomi finally spoke up for the first time. "Hold on, wait a minute. What are you saying? Are you saying I inherited worthless stocks while Catherine got $10 million? That's not fair," Naomi exclaimed loudly. Beside Naomi's outburst, my brother sighed. "Naomi, I inherited our father's estate. You weren't at a disadvantage in any way. Why are you so upset?" But I thought we were getting all of that $100 million. I had plans for it." My husband glared sharply at the flustered Naomi. "So you and Robert were plotting to get all of our father's money, and while doing that, you were having an affair, weren't you?" my brother accused. Naomi and my husband remained silent, frozen in place. "Why?" Naomi muttered hoarsely. My brother glanced at her before continuing. "After our phone call, I started suspecting Naomi. Why didn't she talk to me about the inheritance? Why had her interactions with me been so brief lately, and why had she started ignoring my calls? I thought something was fishy, and when I saw her pictures on social media, I knew she was cheating on me. And soon, I'll be getting a lot of money. I'll be living like a famous person. I've been discussing with my girlfriend how we'll spend it. She said we'll have a blast when we get the money. I'm thrilled. But Naomi, I don't recall talking about this with you. I wonder who this girlfriend is. No, wait. You're misunderstanding, Naomi interrupted. Ignoring his confused wife, my brother brought out a bait envelope. He took some photos out and placed them next to the will. They showed Naomi and Robert going into a hotel together, looking very close. It was obvious they were in a tight relationship. I've been overseas, you know. I hired a private investigator to look into things because I was curious about your girlfriend, my brother said, showing the solid proof. Naomi started trembling. Looking at Naomi's affair partner, my husband, I noticed he was furious, completely red-faced, which was quite different from the pale Naomi. Curse you, poking around like some creep. What's all this nonsense about your silly will in these photos? It's absurd. My husband exploded. Stop. Suddenly, Naomi raised her voice. She approached my brother with a fake charm, like a bad actor. Hey, you're mistaken. It's all a mix-up. It's all Robert's fault. He convinced me that if I went along with him, I'd get all of your dad's money. Hey, wouldn't you want to get $100 million? I thought it was for your own good. My husband, who felt deeply hurt, stared at Naomi in shock. This photo, we were just fooling around. You were always away, and I felt lonely. But you're also to blame, right? Please forgive me. The $90 million is off the table now. Let's take the $10 million from Catherine's property. Did you fake the will? I asked. Huh? No way. Robert did it. He said it was simple and had it written by your dad. Look, it's not my fault, Naomi explained. When the truth about the fake will came out, my husband got furious and tried to attack Naomi, but my brother stepped in quickly. You jerks. You've got nothing on me. You'll pay for this in hell. My husband yelled, kicking a chair. While he raged, my brother calmly watched and casually took out his phone. Oh, looks like my phone was recording the whole time since we got home. I forgot to turn it off. My husband went pale and fell silent. By the way, I didn't mention it earlier, but this room has security cameras that record everything. I installed them because of Dad's bad memory, just in case something happened, my brother added. In the quiet room, only my brother kept speaking. Forging a will is a serious crime. Your earlier threat could get you in legal trouble. There's a police station nearby, and they'd be here soon if we report it. But since the inheritance matter is settled now, and if you promise not to touch Catherine's things again, maybe we don't need to involve the police. What do you say? While saying this, my brother began using his phone. I might as well send this recording to my computer overseas. After silently watching everything, I pulled a document from my bag and handed it to my husband. Robert, I want a divorce. Wait, hold on. Think about this, I'm sorry. We've been together for so long, haven't we? Who do you think has been providing for you all this time? My husband pleaded. I've had it. No more excuses. Either agree to the divorce or I'm calling the police, I said firmly, gripping my smartphone tightly with a determined expression. Robert slumped his shoulders and nodded. Naomi, it's over between us. You were planning to take the money and be with Ken, weren't you? I heard your conversations with him from a private investigator, I accused. Naomi hung her head, covering her face with her hands. After our divorces, my brother and I went our separate ways. Robert moved out of the house, thinking he had secured his significant inheritance, only to find out it was worthless. Naomi revealed the truth about the forged will, and everything that unfolded in the living room was captured on camera. Robert must have been furious, but he was powerless. The surveillance camera, initially installed for my father's care, also documented evidence of Robert's emotional abuse. Even if I had inherited my father's assets, I planned to use them as evidence in a divorce trial if Robert resisted. When I shared this with my brother, he suggested we utilize the camera too. After the divorce, rumors of Robert's affairs spread at his workplace, leading to him losing his job. His colleagues had seen him frequenting hotels with a woman who wasn't his wife. With his parents gone and now jobless and homeless, Robert vanished. While I had sought a portion of his assets, I wanted nothing more to do with him, especially after inheriting some wealth. Naomi, the woman Robert cheated with, faced the same downfall as him. Despite pleading, I don't want us to end. Please don't leave me. During the divorce proceedings with my brother Ken, the divorce was finalized when solid evidence was presented during mediation. Naomi had been spending recklessly while Robert was absent, but she was stuck with the bills, leaving her with nothing. Since she hadn't been working and had no home to go back to like Robert, she's now struggling to get by in a rundown public housing project, relying on welfare. Meanwhile, my brother Ken continues to work overseas, but he's selling the house he shared with Naomi and will be moving in with me into our father's house. With Ken's financial help, my life has become more stable, and I've been able to live comfortably. The value of the land left by my father has been steadily increasing, now worth over $100 million. Free from the responsibilities of caring for my dad and the emotional abuse from my ex-husband, I'm finally living a peaceful life, with time for myself. Alone in a spacious house, I started to think about how to make the most of it. Around that time, I watched a TV show about foreign exchange students staying with host families, and it gave me an idea. I decided to open up my spare rooms for rent. I offer affordable rooms to college and exchange students, and now my house is bustling with life. We share meals, play games, and help each other with schoolwork. It feels like we're one big happy family. On days when I have some free time, I enjoy reading books at the local library. Since I don't have kids of my own, and my marriage had drifted apart, I used to worry about being lonely after losing my father. But now, my days are filled with energy and joy. Even at my age, it's fulfilling to connect with young people and give back to the community in my own small way. There were times when life seemed too hard to handle, but now I have my brother, my roommates, and the people in my neighborhood to share life with. Every day is filled with contentment and happiness. I'm grateful for the simple joy I've found. A funeral dress with a skirt that's too revealing makes me angry. It seems like you're trying to attract men by wearing it. I'm tired of my husband's unfair thoughts. I want a divorce. I'm leaving this house. My name is Kate, and I'm 40 years old. I love chocolate a lot and often end up eating a whole family-sized bar by myself without realizing it. I used to fight with my sister over chocolate when we were younger. Looking back, I wasn't always a mature big sister, but I've seen adults who act even less mature than I did when I was 25. Back then, I had just married my husband, Kevin, who worked at a bank. We met through a friend and got married after about 6 months of dating. Everyone thought I had a perfect life. But things changed after we got married. Every day, when Kevin came home from work, I would greet him and ask about dinner. If it wasn't ready, he'd get upset. So, I made sure to come home before him, cook dinner, and clean up. It was a bit annoying, but Kevin's good salary allowed us to live in a nice house and have a comfortable life. I thought it was normal to have little arguments in a marriage, so I didn't pay much attention to it. But Kevin's behavior kept getting worse. Despite being married, I still visited my parents often, especially to see my 14-year-old sister who was much younger than me. Since our parents worked a lot, I felt like I raised her most of the time. It wasn't because my parents ignored her, but because I loved her so much and wanted to take care of her. My sister was often sick and had to stay in the hospital. Sometimes the doctors would say she might not make it through the night. Thinking about losing her made me love her even more. That's why even after I got married, I continued to visit my sister when she was out of school. But my husband didn't like it. He would say things like, "Who is more important, me or your sister?" When a woman gets married, she should focus on her husband's family. My mother never acted like this. "You're not doing your duty as a wife." He'd go on like this for almost an hour. None of my friends were married at the time, so when I talked to a senior coworker about my husband, she said, "It's your responsibility. When you're married, you have to prioritize your husband." I thought that's how it was supposed to be. Looking back, I realized I was naive. But even then, I couldn't imagine not seeing my sister. My sister's health was getting worse, and she was in the hospital again, only allowed short visits in a sterile room. It's natural for a family to want to be together in times like these. Sometimes, I'd even take a day off from work to go see her, and I started going to the hospital even on days when my husband was off. But my husband strongly disagreed with this. One day, out of the blue, he invited his mother, my mother-in-law, over to our house. With her there, he confronted me. "What are you even thinking? I work hard to take care of our home, and you can't even do that properly. You're just hopeless. I've told you so many times not to wear skirts, yet you still do. It's inappropriate for a married woman to wear a skirt. What's the problem with me wearing the clothes I like? And this dress was chosen by my sister. I can't just give up on it." "See, there you go again, always bringing up your sister Kate. You should be caring more about me. After all, who do you think supports you? Hey, I work too. You can't just claim you're the only one providing. This argument isn't getting us anywhere. Listen, I've already called your workplace and told them you're quitting. You should be thankful. From now on, your focus will be on taking care of the house. What are you talking about? You can't make decisions like this without asking me first. I'm not going to listen to you. Starting today, you're going to live with my mom. Maybe then you'll learn how to be a proper wife. I don't understand what's gotten into you. You're acting irrationally. Shut up. The angry husband smashed a glass on the floor and continued to throw things around in his rage. Seeing the broken glass made me truly scared of my husband for the first time. I regretted marrying him, wondering how I ended up with someone like him. Later, I tried to cancel my resignation with my company, but they told me not to cause any trouble. It turned out my husband had demanded my resignation in a way that was almost abusive, so I lost my job and had to stay at home as my husband wanted. When I told him I quit my job as he wished, he apologized with a smile, saying he might have gone too far. But after seeing his true nature, I couldn't trust his apology. The next day, my husband surprised me by bringing home a group of his coworkers. He proudly introduced me, saying, I wanted to show off my lovely wife, and his colleagues joined in, praising my appearance. Then, out of the blue, he declared, my wife is an amazing cook. You have to taste her food before you leave. I panicked, realizing we didn't have enough food for everyone. It's fine, just make something simple. I don't want you to stress out, he reassured me. I can go shopping if we need more ingredients, one of his female coworkers offered. Your husband really cares about you. I'm jealous, he added. No, he's just good at putting on a show. If he really cared, he wouldn't have brought his coworkers home after a big fight yesterday. I thought bitterly to myself as I started cooking with my mother-in-law. After about 3 hours of eating and drinking, his coworkers finally left. Hi, you. What? I instinctively replied, feeling nervous about what might happen next, given his grumpy mood. I was anxious, afraid he might explode like the day before. Can't you be a bit happier? Seems like I'm not teaching my wife properly, he criticized. I couldn't understand what I did wrong, but I didn't dare to argue. I was too scared. I'm sorry, I mumbled, feeling defeated. Even a child can apologize, he scoffed. Mom, give her a score for today. He turned to his mother for backup. Well, she's not doing a good job supporting her husband, is she? I can't give her any score, his mother replied. Haha, see, even my mom agrees. She can't even give you a score. How funny is that? My husband laughed and lightly tapped me. And about the meal, I tasted a bit. But didn't Kevin find it unsatisfactory? He continued. That's right, Mom. Keep it coming. And what about her clothes? There were men among the colleagues, but she's showing too much skin. What do you think? As a woman, it's indecent to expose your collarbone. She should cover it with a scarf or turtleneck, he added. Whose fault is it that his colleagues suddenly invaded our house and I had to cook without even having time to change my clothes? I retorted. It's Kevin's, I concluded. I couldn't understand why I was constantly being criticized so harshly. She really is something, isn't she? Despite my efforts to teach her every day, she just doesn't seem to learn. Maybe she's just not very smart, my husband remarked. No doubt about it, his mother agreed. That day, I endured a lecture for nearly 2 hours. By the time I finally got a chance to take a bath and go to sleep, it was almost 4 a.m. I had to wake up soon to prepare my husband's lunchbox, so I decided to skip sleep altogether. Despite everything, my husband continued to try to teach me a lesson, especially when I kept visiting my younger sister. About a month and a half later, I received the heartbreaking news of my sister's passing. I wished it was a lie, I murmured, desperately hoping that my mother's announcement of my sister's passing was just a cruel joke. I had been warned countless times about my sister's critical condition, and I had even shared what I thought would be my last moments with her. I thought I was prepared, but my heart couldn't accept the reality. She was only 14 years old. I questioned whether my sister, who endured painful treatments and constant hospital stays, had truly found happiness in her life. As her older sister, had I been able to bring her joy? However, the last expression I saw on her face in the hospital was a smile. It seemed she hadn't suffered. You fought bravely and you did your best. Thank you for everything, I whispered through tears as I hugged my sister and bid her a final farewell. The funeral passed in a blur, and I realized I hadn't been home for several days. I informed my husband about my sister's passing, but as expected, he didn't bother to attend the funeral. Instead, he said something hurtful like, "You should prioritize me over the dead." Unable to bear such cruel words at such a time of grief, I ignored him and hung up the phone. When I finally returned home, weighed down by sorrow, my husband and mother-in-law were waiting for me at the door, looking stern and unwelcoming. "You're quite late, aren't you?" my husband remarked. "A family member has passed away. I couldn't just come back in a few hours. How can you accuse me of lying so easily?" I replied, feeling hurt and frustrated. "What? Are you going through a rebellious phase? Always lying and defying me. Whose wife do you think you are?" he retorted. "Wait a minute, my sister really did die. It's not a lie," I insisted. I wonder. Even though you haven't greeted me at the door in days, even if you're wearing a skirted suit now, it's hard to believe you," he replied dismissively. "Why is it hard to believe?" I asked, confused and upset. "If you truly love your husband, you should be able to do it. It's your duty as a wife to welcome your husband home." My husband scolded me, accusing me of being incompetent, and don't even think about denying it. "Are you having an affair?" "What? No matter how many times I tell you," he dressed provocatively, "and the other day you were flirting with my colleague. You're just interested in other men, aren't you? What a disgraceful woman," he continued, hurling hurtful accusations at me. "What the heck?" I started to argue back, fueled by anger and forgetting my fear of my husband. But then it happened. "Divorce, huh? Fine by me. Someone as frivolous as Kate isn't fit for Kevin, right?" My mother-in-law chimed in. My husband mumbled, trying to stop her, but I seized the opportunity. "I agree with Mom. Let's get a divorce," I declared firmly. My husband kept pleading with me to reconsider, but I had made up my mind. I couldn't risk staying with him any longer, afraid that his violence might escalate. This was my chance, and I was certain it was the right time to end our marriage. So I quickly packed my things and left the house. My husband kept insisting, "If you apologize, I'll forgive you." But I ignored him, thinking he must be delusional. He persisted until the end, grabbing my arm tightly and saying, "Wait." But I reacted instinctively, hitting him in the face with my bag and running away. I headed straight for a specific place, a room in an apartment that I had prepared just in case something like this happened. As soon as I entered the room, I received a call from my mother-in-law on my cell phone. "Hello. Kate, did you arrive safely?" she asked concernedly. "Yes, I'm fine. I'm in a taxi, so Kevin won't find out," I reassured her. "That's good. Make sure to hire a lawyer and proceed with the divorce quickly," she advised. "Yes, I can't wait to start living independently," I replied. In reality, my mother-in-law and I had been pretending to be at odds in front of my husband. It all began the day my husband brought a colleague home. After his lecture ended and my husband fell asleep, my mother-in-law approached me. "Leave this house. Get away from my son," she urged me. Each time my husband criticized me, my mother-in-law, who seemed to have her suspicions, would ask, "Really?" It turned out her late husband had been very much like my husband, and she had endured a lot in her own marriage. In her generation, divorce was frowned upon, so she couldn't end her own marriage. But it seems she wanted something better for me. Watching the interactions between my husband and me, she must have felt compelled to help me. That's when my mother-in-law, with the help of a friend, found a safe place for me to live alone. It's hard to believe she's related to my husband. I can't thank her enough for her kindness. After living in the apartment she arranged for me for 2 weeks, my mother-in-law finally visited, pulling along a suitcase. "Welcome. I'm looking forward to this new chapter," she greeted me warmly. Living with us, my mother-in-law discovered that her own son had changed. Before, he seemed like a good person, the image he presented to his colleagues. My mother-in-law blamed herself, believing that his behavior was influenced by his father's genes or things he witnessed during his childhood. For me, regardless of the reasons behind his behavior, I believe the real issue lies in his inability as an adult to control his emotions. So I don't hold my mother-in-law responsible. My husband now takes good care of my mother-in-law, but only because he thinks she's on his side. I fear what he might do if he discovers she's been helping me with the divorce. That's why I suggested she come live with me for a while when she prepared this house. At first, she hesitated, worrying that once my husband and I divorce, she'd become a stranger to me. But I assured her, saying, "After everything you've done for me, there's no daughter-in-law distinction. You're like my mother or my sister. That's how I see you." On the way back from my sister's funeral, my mother-in-law steered the conversation toward divorce, intentionally supporting me. Recognizing her intentions, I quickly agreed to the divorce. I thought it would take more time and preparation to leave my husband, but thanks to my mother-in-law's help, that time came sooner than expected. I have nothing but gratitude for her. Finally, the divorce was officially settled through the lawyer. 4 days later, as I returned to the apartment, I was startled to find my ex-husband waiting for me outside. "I found you. You're trying to trick me," he accused loudly. Does he know about what happened? I wondered silently, trying to remain composed. "What do you want now?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "It's your fault that the credit card and bank account balances have decreased," he blamed me. "What are you talking about?" "I don't understand," I replied, feigning innocence. In truth, before the divorce, I was using my husband's credit card to gradually buy furniture for this house. I also quietly withdrew money from the bank account. It was all part of my plan, I confessed. When I discussed this with my mother-in-law, she encouraged me to go ahead with it, so I emptied the account without any hesitation. The reason why my unemployed mother-in-law and I can live comfortably, enjoying tea parties every night, is because of this money. That's my money. "You can't just do whatever you want without facing the consequences," he shouted angrily. "Remember the money we have? It's from the credit card we got after we got married and the money we saved together. Since we're married, it's both of ours," I explained, smiling at him. Suddenly, my mother-in-law returns from shopping and says, "Oh, you found out, didn't you?" Surprised, my ex-husband stands speechless behind me. "Hey, you're back," I greet my mother-in-law, trying to keep things normal. "What? Why is Mom here?" my husband asks, confused. "Well, because we're living together," I respond, with my husband still puzzled and my mother-in-law acting like it's no big deal. "So, you lied about going back to your parents' house, and why are you living with Kate, not me?" he questions. "I'm lost," Kevin admits. "Well, I've lost hope in you, Kevin," his mother replies. "What? But I'm the one who helped Kate get away," Kevin protests. "Actually, Kevin, Kate and I had already planned to split up before you even knew about it," his mother reveals. "But Mom, you were saying terrible things about Kate." "Yes, well, when I was criticizing her, I was really imagining you in her place," his mother confesses. "What do you mean?" Kevin asks, confused. "Because you're not the sharpest tool in the shed, and you get all worked up over silly things like a woman showing her collarbone. I was worried Kate would be in trouble. She deserved someone better than you for a husband," Kevin's mother bluntly tells him. Kevin is taken aback by his mother's harsh words. Meanwhile, I find her response so unexpectedly funny that I burst into laughter. "Mom, you do realize I'm your son, don't you?" Kevin asks, trying to make sense of it. "Unfortunately, yes." "I guess I should have raised you differently," his mother responds dryly. I can't help it, and my laughter grows even louder. "You're just a chit off the old block, like your dad. Watching you mistreat Kate reminded me of my own past. I worried that if she left you, you'd come crawling back to me. I couldn't take that chance, so I left you and moved in with Kate, for both our sakes," Kevin's mother explains. Kevin's mother's confession brings tears to his eyes. He finally explodes. "Is it my fault? Why? You're my child. You've been neglecting me." His mother laughs, almost incredulously. "Do I still need to mother a grown man who's almost 30, she scoffs. A few neighbors gathered as our argument escalated in the yard. They chuckled at my ex-husband's dramatic outburst, saying, "He's really making a scene." With people watching, he didn't dare lay a hand on us and retreated to his house. But the next day, he seemed to have completely lost it. He started spreading rumors about us to his friends and co-workers who used to hang out at our place. My ex may seem nice, but she ignores her husband, he complained to anyone who would listen. One woman at his office fired back, "You know, your behavior is exactly why women are wary of their husbands. It's becoming a societal problem." Although no one openly agreed, the vibe at work made it clear that Kevin was in the wrong, and he felt increasingly isolated. In the end, my ex-husband, who turned out to be quite sensitive, couldn't handle the judgmental stares and whispers anymore. He quickly quit his job. It's ironic how he was so quick to criticize me but couldn't handle criticism himself. How sad. Feeling alone, he sent me a lengthy letter trying to justify his behavior and boasting about his greatness as a man. The letter was a whopping 10 pages long. I was surprised when I received the thick envelope. I had blocked his texts, but if he could write this much by hand, I can only imagine how many texts he would have sent. His final line was, "If you ever miss me, feel free to contact me." So I playfully replied, "Then please go ahead with the property division." That sparked another big argument. I used to be afraid when we lived together, but not anymore. I stood my ground with my lawyer. Even before his mother suggested I leave, I had secretly been recording his behavior at home, preparing for a divorce. All those months enduring his hurtful words paid off. With the evidence, I successfully sorted out the property division. After that, I moved out from living with my ex-mother-in-law when I found a new job. It was still close enough for a reasonable commute. Surprisingly, she had found herself a boyfriend. It turned out the person who introduced us to the apartment was her new beau. She left with him, holding hands, and said, "Come visit us once we're settled." I must admit, my ex-mother-in-law really surprised me. She's a fantastic woman, and it's clear why she's so well liked, regardless of her age. As for me, I spent my best years focused on work after changing careers, thinking I might have missed my chance for remarriage. However, I started joining regular online gatherings with my colleagues. This gave me more opportunities to casually exchange contact info with people I didn't usually talk to, including a director from another department who showed interest in me. At first, I kept my distance because we worked for the same company. But as we began having private online chats about things we couldn't discuss at work, we grew closer and eventually started dating. The head of the department, who hadn't been in a relationship for years since his last girlfriend left him because of his workaholic tendencies, treated me with caution, saying, "I don't want to repeat the same mistake." And happily, we decided to tie the knot next year. I was concerned that his parents might not approve of me, considering I've been divorced before and he's getting married for the first time. However, I'm relieved to see his parents are accepting and even grateful, saying, "Thank you for being with our son." When I shared the news of my upcoming marriage with my ex-mother-in-law, she was genuinely happy for me. Oh, and about my ex-husband, it seems he found a job at a different bank and got remarried. But knowing his personality, it's likely he's been divorced again. That makes it 3 divorces now. He works at a bank and initially comes off as charming, but he tends to blame his ex-wives for the divorces, which makes it seem like women fall for him. Even when my ex-mother-in-law tries to warn women about his true nature at wedding receptions, he manages to manipulate them skillfully. Well, after 3 divorces, it's likely he'll start being avoided by women. I just hope there won't be any more victims. With the way he's going, he probably won't have a good ending because he's likely disliked by many women. But honestly, it's not my concern anymore. Guess what it's like to travel abroad with my husband's money, my sister-in-law Betty boasted. "I wonder how it feels to rely not only on your parents but also on your brother," she added, sounding a bit rude. I felt really angry at her boldness. "Well, you're not any better. You stay at home all day but still hire a maid and don't do any chores," I snapped back. "That's enough, both of you, stop it," my father interrupted as our argument started to get out of hand. He calmed me down with a gentle look and then turned to Betty. "It seems like you both can't enjoy your trip with us here. We'll head back home. Sorry for disturbing," he said politely. "My name is Lisa. I'm almost 40 years old and I work while living with my father. My mom passed away from an illness 10 years ago, and my younger brother Jake, who is 5 years younger than me, has already gotten married and moved out. I live simply with my father in our Bay house. It's not that I can't afford to live on my own. I choose to live with my father because I worry about him. After my mom died, he started having a lot of health problems and had to stop working as he got closer to retirement age. His health got worse to the point where he wouldn't eat for days unless reminded and would be stuck in bed for almost 2 weeks if he got sick. I couldn't leave my dad alone in that condition. At that time, my brother Jake was already working as a lawyer and was engaged to be married. Jake and his fiancée were planning to build a new home near ours, so it was obvious that I would continue living with my father. Jake is very talented compared to me. I never expected his wife to be so difficult. Jake's wife, Betty, stopped working as soon as they got married and became a homemaker. She doesn't do any chores herself and relies on a hired butler. Her days mostly involve fancy lunches and shopping at expensive stores. Jake is busy with his job, so he might not have much time to spend with Betty. But her extravagant lifestyle is surprising. Living near Jake in Betty's house, I couldn't help but hear about Betty's carefree life. What made it worse were her comments when she visited us. "When are you going to move out, Lisa? Aren't you embarrassed to still live at home at your age?" She teased me. I often bit my tongue and just smiled vaguely, not wanting to hear such words from a woman who doesn't do any housework and just enjoys herself. I wish she wouldn't come over at all, I thought to myself. But my father felt sorry for Betty, thinking Jake might be too busy and she might feel lonely. He didn't push her away. Instead, he often invited her to have dinner with us. I wish Jake and my father could understand how much Betty's behavior was affecting me emotionally. But when I saw my father, unaffected by Betty's bold attitude, happily eating dinner with her, I couldn't help but feel like as long as he was happy, that was all that mattered. Why did Jake marry someone like her? I often wondered about it, but I figured there must be qualities in Betty that only Jake could appreciate. I chose to ignore Betty's rude comments and quietly continued eating. That day, like usual, my father invited Betty to join us for dinner. Jake had been really busy with work lately, and Betty usually just helped herself to food prepared by the housekeeper. Maybe feeling sorry for Betty, my father decided to buy some fancy ingredients and suggested that the three of us have a nice meal together. I wasn't very excited about it, but since my father insisted, I didn't have much of a choice. I went to the supermarket in town and bought some ingredients, then managed to make some dishes I'd never tried before. My father, who hadn't been eating much lately, was really happy and joked, saying, "I'm extra hungry today." Betty showed up quite a bit later than we agreed and plopped down in a dining chair without even saying hello properly. The dishes I'd made were all laid out in front of her. "Now that we're all here, let's dig in," my father said cheerfully, but Betty didn't seem happy. She pushed the food around with her fork, let out a big sigh, and said, "Do you really expect me to eat something that looks this unappetizing?" Betty shot me a disdainful look as she glanced at the dishes. I stared back at her and turned to my father in surprise. He also seemed taken aback, his mouth hanging open as he looked at Betty. "Well, it might not be as fancy as what your housekeeper prepares, but Lisa made all of this herself. Can't you show a bit more respect?" My father responded sternly. Betty immediately frowned. "I never said I wanted to eat with you guys. I'm just trying to create some memories here, and you serve me something that looks so unappealing. Can't you think about how I feel?" "What do you mean by making memories?" I muttered under my breath, but Betty caught on quickly. She looked down at me and my father, smirked, and said something shocking. "Well, your father won't be around for much longer, will he? I'm the devoted daughter-in-law keeping him company." So, I was expecting a sizable inheritance. At that moment, both my father and I were stunned into silence. The room fell quiet. Could this really be the woman that the smart Jake chose to marry? Talking about inheritance before someone has even passed away. There's something really wrong with that. "You're going to live for many more years." Before I knew it, I was shouting. Even Betty, who had been grumpily playing with her food, stopped when she saw me venting my anger. "Don't talk about inheritance to my dad. He might just be another person to you, but he's family to me. He's also family to Jake. He's the only living relative left for us after we lost our mother." My father gently restrained me as I leaned over the table, breathing heavily. I slowly sat back down, my anger toward Betty still burning inside. With a deep breath that seemed to break the tension, I felt my pent-up emotions deflate. "I'll pretend I didn't hear what you just said," my father said in a calm voice. Immediately, Betty scoffed. "All I did was speak the truth. I don't want the inheritance to go to a woman who's still living with her parents." Betty's words were blunt. I didn't have the energy to be angry anymore. She boldly brought up what my father had tried to ignore and hurled her insulting words and actions at us. "I'll leave this old house to you, sister-in-law. Looks like you won't have to worry about losing your place to live," Betty said with a mocking laugh. I wanted to argue back, but when I saw my father quietly shaking his head, I held my tongue. My father was too forgiving with Betty, even as she feels lonely because Jake is often busy with work. It's not right to excuse an adult who doesn't know how to speak respectfully. My father glanced at my expression and murmured softly, "She's the one Jake picked." There was a sad smile on my father's face. He looked like a dad dealing with a troublesome daughter and also like a man who's been worn down by life. I couldn't bring myself to say anything when I saw my father's expression. I had words for both my father and Betty, but more than anything, I wanted to know what Jake thought about all of this. It's uncertain if Jake knows about Betty's behavior. If he's aware of it and ignoring it, then I feel obligated to speak up as his sister. In the end, Betty hardly ate the food I cooked and left early after a short conversation. Only my father and I remained in the spacious living room. Making memories, huh? Maybe she's onto something, I sighed quietly, noticing my father's figure suddenly appearing smaller as he muttered those words. Following Jake's suggestion, our family decided to take a trip to France. My father wanted to visit France while he could still walk without assistance, so Jake and I organized the trip. Initially, I suggested to Jake that he and Dad go on the trip alone without me, since Betty often made snide remarks toward me. I didn't want to spoil the happy atmosphere of the trip. However, Jake insisted that it would be better to have someone who usually observes Dad's condition, so he ended up buying 4 tickets. I reluctantly agreed to join them on the trip to France, and as I anticipated, Betty was in a sour mood the entire time, not speaking a word to anyone on the plane. Once we arrived, we headed straight to the heart of Paris and enjoyed sightseeing. My father was surprisingly lively, exploring every corner with enthusiasm. Betty seemed to brighten up a bit when Jake bought her a designer bag. She walked arm in arm with Jake, but I couldn't help but notice that Jake didn't seem particularly happy at that moment. I accidentally locked eyes with Betty, and she glared at me so intensely that my heart skipped a beat. By the way, why is Lisa even here with us? Betty let go of Jake's arm and confronted me. I asked her to come just in case something happens to Dad. We need someone who can handle it. Jake tried to intervene, but it seemed like his words didn't register with Betty. She continued to stare at me, smirking. Betty spoke in a mean way, asking what it's like to use her husband's money to travel abroad. She said not to spend too much because plane tickets are expensive. Then she rudely suggested that Lisa could sleep outside instead of in their fancy hotel suite. Jake tried to stop her, but she didn't listen. Betty insulted Lisa, saying she lives off her family's money, including her brother's. Lisa felt really angry and upset at this. She fired back, saying Betty actually lives off Jake's money even though she's a housewife. Lisa pointed out that Betty hires someone else to do the housework. Their dad stepped in before things got worse. He calmly told Betty they'd leave because their presence was ruining her trip. He apologized to Lisa and asked her to check the bus schedule to the airport. Betty looked pleased. But Jake seemed worried. Jake suddenly realized that they would be left without anyone to help them once their parents left. He desperately tried to stop them from leaving, but their dad remained firm in his decision. He asked Lisa to check the bus schedule to the airport and promptly headed in that direction. Lisa had to follow her dad while keeping an eye on her brother and his wife. As they walked away, Jake shouted that they would be fine without their parents, disrespectfully calling them old man and old lady. Lisa felt upset at Betty for calling their dad old, but she didn't dwell on it. She hurried after her dad, listening to Jake's distressed cries and Betty's insults directed at him. Eventually, Jake burst into the cafe near the airport where they were having tea, looking frantic and sweaty. He rushed to their table and bowed his head in a flurry of panic. "I'm really sorry for what happened earlier. I'll make a proper apology later, but right now, I need your help with Betty," Jake said earnestly, bowing deeply. Dad and I exchanged surprised looks. "What happened to Betty?" I asked on behalf of Dad, prompting Jake to explain what happened after we left. Jake and Betty took a taxi to the hotel after we left on the bus to the airport. However, they encountered a problem once they were in the taxi. They couldn't communicate well with the driver because neither of them spoke French, and the driver didn't speak English. Despite the driver asking them something, they couldn't understand and ended up getting out of the taxi without realizing Betty was still inside. Jake expressed concern that he couldn't reach Betty on the phone and worried she might have been mugged or faced some other trouble after being left by the taxi. Realizing he needed help and feeling overwhelmed by the situation due to his lack of understanding of French, Jake turned to us for assistance. I reassured him that both my father and I are fluent in French. Despite Betty thinking of my father as incapable due to his age, he used to be a French teacher and I currently teach French. This trip to France was planned by Jake as a way for my father to reminisce about his youth, Upon arriving in France, my father seemed revitalized by memories of his time studying abroad. Since I also had experience studying in France during my student days, after parting ways with my brother and his wife, we shared stories about our time in France. My father listened intently, eventually nodding in understanding. Let's head back to the city center. I'm guessing the taxi that dropped you off might be waiting for its next passenger there, my father suggested. Following my father's advice, we swiftly prepared ourselves and embarked on a mission to locate Betty, who had been left behind somewhere. My father and I decided to split up and search for the taxi that had dropped off my brother and his wife when they returned to the city center. It's common for taxi drivers in the area to speak French fluently without needing to use English. Before I could reach them, my father managed to find the taxi that had taken Jake and Betty, leading us to the spot where Betty was supposed to have been dropped off. Thankfully, Betty was there, safe but looking weary. However, upon her arrival, it became evident that she had been robbed. All her bags and belongings were missing, leaving her with nothing. When Betty spotted Jake's face, tears started to form in her eyes, but she quickly put on a frown upon seeing us. "Why are they here, Betty?" Jake asked, clearly annoyed, and let out a heavy sigh. "If it wasn't for them, you'd have been stranded here with nothing, Betty. You should be thankful," Jake scolded her. Betty looked uncertain. "What do you mean?" "Without them, our trip would have been a mess. We can't speak French, so that's why we're in this situation. But they're different. They're both French teachers, much better at it than I am," Jake clarified. Betty seemed uneasy, glancing over at us. A troubling thought crossed my mind, and I quietly told Betty, "If we hadn't found you, you might have had to sleep on the streets here." Betty clenched her lip in frustration. "And besides, Jake and I split the expenses for the trip equally. So how can you say it's all funded by an old lady living off her parents' money?" With that, Betty began to tremble. "It's your father's money anyway, right?" In response to Betty's argument, my father gently shook his head. "I didn't do anything, Lisa. Jake and Betty are doing well on their own. They're my pride and joy." Just as I felt Betty's glare bore into me, she fell silent, refusing to say a single word of thanks despite being helped. I had a lot I wanted to say to her, but my father's whispered advice to take it easy made me restrain myself and stay quiet. This must have been a very embarrassing moment for Betty. She probably never expected to be rescued by someone she had looked down upon. Even Jake seemed tired of Betty's stubborn hostility towards us, his frustration evident on his face. "Well, now that everything's sorted out, shall we continue our sightseeing? Let's go to a restaurant I used to love when I was studying here," my father suggested cheerfully. With my father's optimistic suggestion, our family was united once again. We had a fantastic time in France, ignoring Betty's gloominess and fully enjoying our trip. When we returned to the States, Jake kept apologizing to us and surprisingly decided to divorce Betty. I was shocked and asked him why they had married in the first place. It turned out Betty had lied about being pregnant and pressured Jake into marrying her. After they got married, it became clear that she wasn't pregnant at all. Jake had hesitated to divorce her earlier because of his public image, but he couldn't tolerate Betty's disrespect towards my father and me anymore. After the divorce, Betty was forced out of their home and couldn't continue living as a housewife. Without a maid to help with household chores, she faced difficulties. Additionally, she lost half of her assets due to a pickpocket incident during our trip to France. She must be working hard now to make ends meet. Meanwhile, my father became noticeably happier and more lively, reminiscing about his youth in France during our trip. I decided to quit my teaching job and started a French language school at home. I hope to renovate it soon and have my father join me as a French teacher. Our family's dreams are growing, and we're excited about the future. "I can't believe you brought homemade pudding." My business partner teased me, expecting fancier desserts. He tossed the pudding in the trash, leaving me speechless. Feeling angry and helpless, I went home. My wife seemed oddly cheerful, promising that the rude man would face consequences. The next day, something surprising happened when I went to meet the president. "My name is Danny Klein, and I've been working in an office for 10 years now. Today, I'm feeling nervous because I have to bring a gift to a tough business partner named Walter Morris. He's picky about gifts, and if he doesn't like yours, he won't even talk to you properly. Sometimes he'll even make up excuses to send you away. But he's important for our business, so I have to deal with him." One day, my manager came to my desk and praised our company's great patented technology. I agreed, but also mentioned how they'd become arrogant because of it. We used to work together closely, but things have changed. My manager looked at me sympathetically. I chuckled bitterly and ran my hand through my hair. I've heard that the president and his wife are nice people, despite Walter being difficult. I hope things improve soon. Yeah, things should get better soon. It's tough, but it's all part of the job. Thanks, I'll give it my best shot, I replied to my manager. But finding the right gift every time is such a hassle. If I get him the same thing again, he accuses me of being lazy, I complained. My manager suggested, the president's wife really likes pudding. Maybe next time you see them, consider getting some pudding. As soon as my manager mentioned it, I thought of a special pudding from a local store. It was incredibly smooth and creamy, just melting in your mouth. It had the perfect balance of richness and sweetness, exactly like the pudding my wife, Lily, makes. Lily runs a small pastry shop from our home, and her puddings are a hit with everyone in the neighborhood. They're so popular that they often sell out by mid-afternoon, loved by both kids and seniors alike. After work, I hurried home to find Lily already in the kitchen, preparing dinner. As I entered, a sweet aroma filled the air, making me smile. Lily greeted me with a cheerful welcome home, humming a tune as she worked. Excitedly, I told her about my conversation with the boss and how his wife loved pudding. I want to take some as a gift. Can you make some? I asked eagerly. Lily hesitated for a moment before asking, Do you think my pudding will be good enough? I could see a hint of nervousness behind her smile, but it reassured me. Even though Lily makes amazing puddings, making one as a gift for my business partner's wife was understandably stressful for her. Still, she agreed with a nod and said, okay. Once dinner was ready, Lily didn't even sit down to eat. Instead, she jumped straight into preparing the pudding for tomorrow, insisting she needed to get it done. Thank you, Lily. I'm sorry, I said, feeling grateful but guilty. It's no problem. I want more people to taste my pudding, Lily replied cheerfully, diving into the preparations. She moved back and forth between the kitchen and her shop, busy with the task. Seeing her determination, I couldn't just stand there watching. I decided to pitch in and help, following Lily's instructions closely. We ended up staying up later than usual, eagerly anticipating the reaction of the boss and his wife the next day. I fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I woke up to find Lily already awake, her head popping out from the shop, wearing a white apron. It's ready, she announced, holding a tray of neatly wrapped puddings in her hands. Thank you, Lily, I expressed my gratitude, not knowing how early she must have woken up to prepare everything. I thanked her repeatedly, feeling appreciative of her effort. Lily, looking a bit bashful, responded, It didn't take too long because you helped me. As I reminisced about the morning's activities, a smile crept onto my face. I carefully placed the puddings, wrapped in white paper bags with blue ribbons, on the passenger seat and let out a sigh. With renewed confidence, I started the company car. There shouldn't be any problem with Lily's pudding. It's sure to impress. That's what I believed, until I heard a voice that crushed my hopes. What's this? Just like always. I mentioned Walter's name to the receptionist with a smile, and she asked me to wait for a moment. Taking a seat in the entrance, I made sure the pudding in the bag was safe. As I waited, I noticed Walter approaching from the elevator, wearing a slight smile. When he glanced at what I was holding, he immediately questioned, What is this? With doubt in his voice. I couldn't help but flinch. Nevertheless, I replied calmly, It's just a small gift. It's pudding made by my wife, who runs a pastry shop. But before I could finish, Walter scoffed, Pudding, are you mocking me? Shouldn't you bring something fancier? His words were filled with disdain, and he looked at me as if he were mocking me. At first, I didn't understand, but as it sank in, I felt my fists clenching in anger. Walter was a client I had been working with smoothly until now. I couldn't afford to ruin our relationship, so I swallowed my emotions and tried to reason with him. Even though it's not fancy, my wife's puddings are quite popular, I explained, but Walter dismissed it, saying, No way. I can't eat pudding made by an amateur. He snatched the bag of pudding from my hand roughly, leaving me stunned. What are you doing? I exclaimed, taken aback. My anxious voice clashed with Walter's dry laughter, attracting curious glances from the receptionist and other employees passing by. I can't believe you give me such low-quality stuff, Walter remarked, lifting the bag to his face with a scrutinizing gaze. My anger surged, but I fought to keep my cool. Then I heard him say, "It's the CEO's wife's favorite. Even so, would you bring something made by an amateur?" I defended, feeling the need to stand up for Lily's skill. "My wife is definitely not an amateur. Even so, you must understand that I can't serve such an unsightly pudding to the president." With that, Walter released his grip on the bag, letting it fall into the trash can nearby. It happened so fast that I couldn't react, leaving me standing there in shock. The bag with the pudding inside made a mournful sound as it landed in the bin. A small gasp escaped from the receptionist nearby. "I'll take care of it for you today. Just be more careful next time," Walter stated, his voice dripping with irritation. All I could do was stare at the discarded pudding and mutter a barely audible, "I'm sorry." Walter nodded in response, his expression unreadable. Whether he was satisfied with my apology, I couldn't tell. "I've got some urgent matters to attend to. I hate to do this, but could you please leave?" Without waiting for my response, he turned and headed towards the elevator. I stood there stunned, unable to tear my gaze away from the discarded pudding. Time seemed to blur, and before I knew it, I found myself back in my company car. The memory of Lily's hard work on the pudding weighed heavily on my heart, filling me with a mix of sadness and anger. Most of all, I felt frustrated with myself for not being able to stand up for her or myself. All because Walter was a business partner. I couldn't focus on work that day, my mind consumed with how to tell Lily about what happened. When I got home, Lily greeted me with a smile, casually sipping tea on the couch. Caught off guard, I paused in untying my tie. "Did something happen?" Lily asked, noticing my hesitation and concern. Unable to hide it any longer, I confessed everything to her. "I'm sorry, he threw away the pudding you worked so hard on right in front of me." Lily looked surprised at first, but then she gently squeezed my hand. "It's not your fault. Maybe there was something wrong with the pudding." Deep down though, I knew that wasn't true. Walter hadn't even bothered to look inside the bag before tossing it away. It didn't matter what was inside. If it wasn't up to his standards, it was going in the trash. Before I could apologize again, Lily stopped me. She seemed to think for a moment, then grinned mischievously. "That man's getting fired." "Fired?" I questioned, taken aback by Lily's comment. "I'm just kidding though," she reassured me with a soft chuckle. Even though it might not have been perfect, it's still disheartening to hear that the pudding I worked so hard on was thrown away. Her reaction was understandable. Anyone would be upset to hear their efforts were disregarded like that, even Lily, who rarely makes such remarks about rude clients. "But who knows, it could happen," she added mysteriously, leaving me feeling a bit puzzled. But that was the end of our conversation. Lily urged me to wash up early that night, so I bathed in a mix of confusion and frustration before turning in earlier than usual. The next day, still feeling weighed down by yesterday's events, I headed to work with a heavy heart. My boss had instructed me the day before. "I know it's not ideal, but tomorrow you need to buy a cake from the high-end Western confectionery store in front of the station." His words echoed in my mind as I stopped by the pastry shop near the station on my way to work and bought a cake. I placed the box from the fancy pastry shop on the passenger seat, letting out a sigh heavier than the day before. Yesterday, I had promised Walter that I'd come back today with an apology gift. Maybe because of the incident, Walter had responded with an even more arrogant tone. "All right, I'm counting on you this time," he said before hanging up. I should get going, I told myself, mustering up some motivation as I settled into the driver's seat of my company car. I drove towards the client's office, determined to make things right. As I entered through the automatic doors, a receptionist who recognized me hurried over. "Are you Mr. Klein from Company X?" she asked. "Yes, that's me, but please, lead the way," I replied. Following her, I stepped into the elevator, and before I knew it, we had arrived at our destination floor. The room I was directed to turned out to be the president's office. The receptionist knocked a few times, and when the door opened, I was ushered in. Inside, I found the president of the client company, his wife, and Walter, all looking uneasy. I had expected Walter to be his usual arrogant self, especially after yesterday's incident, but I was surprised. "Nice to meet you, I'm Danny Klein from Company XX. Thank you for having me here today," I said, puzzled by the situation, as I greeted the president, Mr. Peterson. "You must be Danny. Pleasure to meet you." "I'm Mr. Peterson, and this is my wife, Anne," Mr. Peterson replied, cutting the formalities short. They exchanged glances, then called my name and bowed deeply. We are truly sorry for what happened. Please accept our apologies, Mrs. Peterson added sincerely. I'm sorry, what did you say? I asked, feeling surprised by how the president's tone suddenly changed. His wife, standing beside him, looked shocked too, bowing her head without saying a word. I quickly asked them to lift their heads, but they wouldn't. Then, I noticed Walter, who was standing behind them, also bowing. This was unusual because Walter was usually very proud and never apologized. But there he was, saying sorry with careful words for the first time. I was taken aback and didn't know what to say. Walter continued, actually, yesterday my wife found something in the lobby trash while she was cleaning. His wife nodded to confirm. She seemed upset and asked around about it. She found out that the pudding you brought earlier had been thrown away disrespectfully by someone. We called him to ask, and at first, he denied it, but later he admitted it reluctantly. Mr. Peterson gave Walter a cold look, and Walter seemed to feel it as he bit his lip and looked away. I didn't know Mrs. Peterson liked pudding. I thought it was from Danny, and I tossed it without thinking. I'm sorry, Walter said, sounding quieter than usual. I was surprised by Walter's unusual behavior. Mrs. Peterson shook her head firmly. That's not why I'm upset, she said in an angry tone, breaking her silence. Danny, I've known about the pudding from Lily's store for a while. I knew it was really popular and always sold out quickly, even though the store was busy. You made the pudding for me. It's disappointing that an employee of a manufacturing company doesn't appreciate the effort put into making a product. I was shocked that Mrs. Peterson knew about Lily's store and understood the emotions behind making something. Walter, looking even more nervous, tried to apologize again, but Mr. Peterson told him to face the person he was apologizing to and lifted his pale face up. Walter Hooper sincerely apologized to me for carelessly throwing away the handmade gift from your wife yesterday. He faced me directly, bowing his head repeatedly. In that moment, I felt a sense of clarity. When I got home, Lily was sitting on the sofa drinking tea, just like yesterday. Without saying hello, I told her about what had happened today. Lily listened to me without interrupting until I finished. Then she smiled and said, I thought as much. Her calm demeanor suggested she had expected everything that happened. Lily got up and made a cup of tea for me from the kitchen. As she handed it to me, she began to speak. Actually, yesterday evening, a man in a suit came to buy our pudding, but we were all out. He mentioned that the wife of his company's CEO loves our pudding. Could it be the president's wife he meant? Probably Ann Peterson, Lily said with excitement, nodding happily. It's amazing to know there are people who appreciate the effort we put into our products. It motivates me to make even better things for them. Lily took a sip of her tea, still smiling. Seeing her so genuinely happy made me understand Mr. and Mrs. Peterson's words better, but it also made me feel guilty. Did I truly value the effort of producers like Lily while doing my job? I was angry at Walter's arrogance, but was it because I thought we were doing him a favor by selling our products? Maybe I was being carried away too. Like Lily, shouldn't I strive to connect the creator's thoughts with the consumers through my work? As I thought about all of this, Lily noticed something and gently placed her hand on my shoulder. Perhaps from now on, you'll consider both the creators and the users' perspectives. Lily's words made me feel a bit embarrassed, but more importantly, they gave me a new outlook on my job. After everything that happened, Walter's attitude changed a lot. He wasn't as arrogant as before and stopped demanding gifts. Now, we openly share our opinions and have a better relationship. Like Lily, I want to keep delivering the creator's ideas to users through my work.